thank you very much for inviting me to give the talk tonight. And for everyone who's tuning in all over the place, welcome. I'm in Vancouver, and I'm going to be talking about enacting hope. And let me get this so it advances properly. I want to dedicate this talk to the loving memory of a dear friend of mine, Louis Charlon, who unexpectedly passed away the day before yesterday. He was my best friend in graduate school, and we spent many hours roaming the streets of Paris through the nights, talking about cognitive science and philosophy and poetry. And Louis loved to cook, and we cooked countless meals together in Paris and Toronto and Montreal. The picture on the left is Louis and me in Toronto in the early 90s. Louis was a professor of philosophy at Western University who worked on philosophy of emotion and cognitive science and the philosophy of psychiatry and issues having to do with mental health. He was one of the biggest hearted people I've known in my life. And so I'm in a bit of a state of shock and anguish, and we'll see how this goes. But I wanted to remember Louis, and I'm going to be talking today about the French philosopher Gabriel Marcel, who was one of Louis's favorite philosophers and writers. Times are tough. Would you have foreseen 2 years ago that we'd be now in the midst of a global pandemic? At the same time, we face an inescapable planetary climate crisis, and biodiversity experts warn that it makes deadly disease outbreaks increasingly likely. The pandemic has taught us that we can decide on very short notice to severely curtail our fossil fuel-driven economic system while rapidly creating new vaccines that have huge implications for preventing and treating many other diseases. This rapid and collective scientific action proves that anyone who says we can't curb carbon emissions and redirect our energies is wrong. We should learn from this lesson and resist all pressure to go back to business as usual. We shouldn't hope to get back to normal, because that so-called normal, the world we were forced to slow down, if not put on hold, the world of rampant fossil fuel consumption and carbon dioxide emission, with its huge disparities between rich and poor peoples and its systemic racism, that world is pathological and shouldn't be normalized. But just putting the world on hold without being able to hope for the future won't work. That leads to depression and despair. We need hope. But we don't need a backward looking in the rearview mirror kind of hope. That's actually not hope, but rather a misplaced nostalgia. But what would hope be? How should we hope? My title today is Enacting Hope. I'm using the word enact to mean to put into practice. The question is, how do we and how should we practice hope? Of course, this raises the question, what is hope? Or what is it to hope? I'm going to approach these questions as a philosopher does, so this talk will be about the philosophy of hope. To speak of enacting hope already suggests a general answer to our question about what hope is. Hope is an act and a way of being. This way of putting things contrasts with thinking of hope as a feeling or even as a state of mind. I'll come back to this point at the end. I'm going to come at the question, what is hope, by way of two negative assessments of hope, both of which imply that we shouldn't hope, that hope is misguided or even unhelpful. The first assessment is specifically Buddhist. The second one comes from political and environmental activism. Thich Nhat Hanh, in his book, Peace is Every Step, has a chapter called Hope as an Obstacle. Here's what he writes. Hope is important because it can make the present moment less difficult to bear, but that is the most that hope can do for us, to make some hardship lighter. When I think deeply about the nature of hope, I see something tragic. Since we cling to our hope in the future, we do not focus our energies and capabilities on the present moment. Hope becomes a kind of obstacle. If you can refrain from hoping, you can bring yourself entirely into the present moment and discover the joy that is already there, already here. Western civilization places so much emphasis on the idea of hope that we sacrifice the present moment. Hope is for the future. It cannot help us discover joy, peace, or enlightenment in the present moment. I do not mean that you should not have hope, but that hope is not enough. Hope can create an obstacle for you, and if you dwell in the energy of hope, you will not bring yourself back entirely into the present moment. Pema Chodron says similar things about hope in her book, When Things Fall Apart. She writes, "Hope and fear is a feeling with two sides. As long as there's one, there's always the other. In a non-theistic state of mind, abandoning hope is an affirmation, the beginning of the beginning. You could even put abandon hope on your refrigerator door. Hope and fear come from feeling that we lack something. They come from a sense of poverty. We can't simply relax with ourselves. We hold on to hope, and hope robs us of the present moment." Now, it should be said that this anti-hope rhetoric isn't representative of every way of being Buddhist, or even arguably of the core of Buddhist thought. On the contrary, I would argue that a version of the kind of hope I'm going to talk about lies at the core of Buddhist thought, even if it's not singled out in terms of the concept of hope. The Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and the Bodhisattva Path offer hope because they offer confidence and trust in the possibility of liberation. Setting out on these paths requires wishing for liberation for oneself and for all other sentient beings. It should also be said that hope is paramount in Pure Land Buddhism, which is a family of practices and beliefs based on hoping to reach a Buddha field, a pure realm manifested by a Buddha. And on this topic, I would recommend the article by Luis Gomez, Buddhism as a Religion of Hope, which is about Pure Land Buddhism. And since I'm giving this talk to a Zen audience at Upaya, I will remind you that Gary Snyder, in his book, The Practice of the Wild, reports Morimoto Shonen Roshi as saying that Pure Land Buddhism, quote, is the only school of Buddhism that can scold Zen, end quote. Roshi Joan Halifax has also distinguished between ordinary hope and wise hope. She writes, "Ordinary hope is based in desire, wanting an outcome that could well be different from what will actually happen. Not getting what we hoped for is usually experienced as some kind of misfortune. Someone who is hopeful in this way has an expectation that always hovers in the background, the shadow of fear that one wishes will not be fulfilled, that one's wishes will not be fulfilled. This ordinary hope is a subtle expression of fear and a form of suffering. But wise hope is not seeing things unrealistically, but rather seeing things as they are, including the truth of suffering, both its existence and our capacity to transform it. It's when we realize we don't know what will happen that this kind of hope comes alive. In that spaciousness of uncertainty is the very space we need to act." Here's the second kind of negative assessment of hope from Greta Thunberg. She says, "I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day, and then I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is." Greta Thunberg made this statement about hope in her 2019 speech to world leaders about the climate crisis. Her objection comes from taking hope to be an optimistic state of mind based on the expectation of a positive outcome. The criticism is that optimism can't motivate urgent action. Of course, I understand why Thunberg says this, and I admire her activism and commitment. But she's working with a popular and limited conception of hope that conflates it with optimism. Let me distill the main anti-hope claims from these two negative assessments. There are basically 5 of them. The first 4 are the Buddhist ones, and the 5th is the activist one. Hope diverts our attention from the present. Hoping for the future is a kind of clinging. It's based on desire and attachment. Hope is inextricable from fear. If you hope for something, then you fear not getting it. The only positive thing that hope can do is to make some hardship lighter, and hope can't motivate urgent action. To see why these claims are misguided, I want to take you through what, in my estimation, is the deepest philosophical account of hope, which comes from the 20th century French philosopher Gabriel Marcel. I want to guide you through his 1942 essay called Sketch of a Phenomenology and Metaphysic of Hope. Marcel's way of doing philosophy is unique. He's concerned fundamentally with human experience, so that makes his approach phenomenological. He's also fundamentally concerned with the unique character of human existence, so that makes his approach existentialist. He insists that philosophy begin with concrete experience rather than abstractions, and he cycles back constantly to particular examples to illustrate his points and ideas. In the case of hope, his method is to analyze the experience by, in his words, purifying it, which means going through a series of examples that take us from what he calls diluted experiences of hope to the experience at its most complete point of saturation. I'm going to present his ideas by talking about his four main examples: the prisoner, the terminally ill person, the father who waits for news of his son who has gone on a dangerous mission to a distant country, and the mother who persists in hoping for her son's return even though she knows he is dead. The prisoner is his first example. The plight of prisoners in World War I affected Marcel deeply. He came to think of the prisoner and the experience of captivity as a paradigm for the human condition. You can understand what he's getting at if you think about the kinds of confinement we've experienced because of the pandemic. If you're a Buddhist, you're likely familiar with the metaphor of samsara as a prison. Marcel highlights various aspects of the prisoner's experience of captivity, and these may also resonate with your experience during the pandemic. Duration, the sense of time's passage, is altered. Time feels closed down instead of open. There's confinement and the impossibility of moving or acting in certain ways. There's the impossibility, in Marcel's words, of rising to a certain fullness of life, which may be in the realms of sensation or even of thought. In other words, life is, as it were, held down, forcibly limited. Marcel goes on to say that all captivity partakes of the nature of alienation. In other words, captivity involves isolation and estrangement from oneself and from community. And crucially, in all this, it's you yourself that is involved and at stake, so that hoping for release or liberation isn't like hoping for a team to win while you're a spectator in the stands. Now, given all these characteristics of captivity, there is the constant temptation or inclination to despair. And hope is possible only where there is the possibility of despair. This means that the kind of hope Marcel is concerned with isn't what he calls hope of a very low order, as when I hope that James will arrive in time for lunch tomorrow, to use his example. Instead, he's concerned with the kind of hope that's possible only where despair is possible. The less something is experienced as involving trial and captivity, the less room there is for either hope or despair. So if we are to feel hope of a higher order, or hope in a deep and full sense, there must be some sense of captivity or trial, and the consequent temptation to despair. It follows that if we want to understand hope, we need to understand despair. So the next step is to look specifically at despair, and this brings us to Marcel's second example of the terminally ill person. Marcel presents this example in the first person. He writes, "Let us suppose that I develop some incurable illness and that my condition shows no improvement." Marcel says that the essence of despair is, in his words, capitulation before a certain fate laid down by our judgment. I received the judgment from the doctor that I am incurably and terminally ill. I recognize or acknowledge the judgment, repeat it to myself, take it as indicating my fate, and then surrender myself to it. What Marcel means here by capitulation is not that I recognize I will inevitably die from the illness, but rather that I disarm myself as a result, that I, in his words, go to pieces under this sentence. When I do this, I renounce or give up on the idea of remaining myself. We might say of being myself authentically, even in the face of my knowing my fate. Instead, I jump ahead and anticipate my own destruction. And this anticipation only serves to bring on and reinforce my destruction, that is, my inner spiritual destruction. Notice here that what Marcel is saying, though he doesn't put it quite this way, is that when I despair, I divert my attention from the present and cling to a fearful image of the future to which I resign myself. So contrary to what Thich Nhat Hanh and Pema Chodron say, it's despair that destabilizes us from the present, not hope. Now, given that hope is opposite to despair, it must be the opposite of capitulating to a certain fate laid down by our judgment. In other words, hope is finding a way to retain one's integrity, to not fall to pieces, even in the face of what's inevitable. To put it another way, to hope is to find a path through an inner spiritual consolidation that enables one to rise above one's fate, which, for all of us, is death. Despair and hope are also different in relation to how we experience time. When we despair, we feel that time isn't going to bring anything new. It's just going to bring the dreaded outcome that we're surrendering to as fate. This means that despair is incapable of waiting in an open and patient way. Hope is the opposite. It's open, patient, and able to wait. Despair is a closed down and passive resignation. Hope is an active and open waiting. This brings us to Marcel's third example of the father who waits for news of his son who has gone on a dangerous mission to a distant country. The son has been away for a long time and there's been no news of him. His father waits each day for a letter and he grows increasingly anxious as no letter comes. To despair, Marcel says, is first of all to anticipate the repetition of not getting a letter, to anticipate being disappointed, and to anticipate this wound so that one anticipates being nothing but a wounded creature. And secondly, to despair is to become enchanted or spellbound by that repetition. It's as if the father comes under a wicked enchanting spell that he brings on himself and that turns him into nothing but despair. Notice again that despair is clinging or being unable to dislodge oneself from a fearful mental image of the future. To hope, on the other hand, means that the father refuses to come under this spell and that he waits in a patient and open way despite his growing fear. He doesn't deny his fear, but he refuses to fall under the spell of despair. If we relate this back to captivity, the idea is that the father is captive and is undergoing a trial. What hope requires is accepting the trial as an integral part of the self and then transmuting it through an inner creative process. In this way, hope is linked to creativity. I'll come back to this in a minute. We can also see in this example the crucial difference between hope and optimism. Optimism is expecting and desiring a particular good outcome. Greta Thunberg is right that optimism is lazy and can't motivate urgent action. But hope isn't optimism. It isn't expecting a particular good outcome. Hope is an active, open, and patient orientation to the good. The terminally ill person can practice hope even though they have no expectation of being cured. And the prisoner of war can practice hope even if they have no expectation of being liberated. We've now arrived at one of Marcel's most important points. He says we have to distinguish between hope that and hope. I hope that requires an object and is relative to that object. This kind of hope is like desire. But I hope is absolute or unconditional in the sense that it's not relative to an object. It's an orientation to the good without trying to frame the good in the form of an image of a particular desired object. Most philosophers today think of hope only in terms of object-directed hope. They think that when you hope for something, you have to desire it and believe that it's possible. Then they argue about what else you need for hope. They say that you also have to imagine the desired outcome, or that you also have to judge that there are good reasons for your desiring and trying to attain the outcome, or that you also have to have hopeful feelings, that you have to perceive the outcome as encouraging. Philosophers also point out that hope and fear are linked, because if you hope for something, you fear not getting it. For Marcel, these ideas are all limited to I hope that, to relative or conditional hope, and don't touch I hope, absolute or unconditional hope. Relative hope arises in tandem with fear. To hope for something is also to fear not getting it. But unconditional hope is the antidote to despair, because it's an open receptivity to the good. In other words, where there's relative hope, there's fear, but where there's unconditional hope, despair is absent. The crucial point is that unconditional hope is transformative. It transcends desire and thereby transforms the self. Conditional or relative hope, I hope that, can't do this. Now, at this point, you might object, but isn't the father hoping that he will have news from his son and that his son will return? And isn't the hope more vivid and real to the extent that the father imagines this particular outcome? Marcel anticipates this objection, and this brings us to how he thinks about imagination in relation to despair and hope, and how he thinks of unconditional hope as a practice, as something to be enacted. When we desire or fear something that isn't present, we imagine it. When we despair, we dread the imagined object and we become enchanted by it. We continually enact despair because we live by imagining and anticipating the dreaded object. And this way of being advances, as it were, the onset of what we dread. Now, you might think the way to counteract this is to imagine the opposite thing. The self-help advice would be for the father to imagine the son's return, the prisoner to imagine his liberation, and the terminally ill person to imagine a miraculous, spontaneous remission of their cancer. But Marcel says this would be a mistake. This is relative, I hope that, not unconditional hope. Marcel says that in the case of hope, the more that I vividly imagine what I hope for, the more hope slides toward the illusory. In other words, part of the inner creative process in hope, part of the practice of enacting unconditional hope, is to not allow yourself to get sucked into imagining, I would prefer to say fantasizing, a hoped-for object. For hope to be unconditional, it has to transcend fantasy. Otherwise, it's hope relative to an imaginary object, a fantasy. We have to find a way to hope, to enact hope, without fixation, without being fixated on a particular object or a particular way of being liberated from our captivity. So what the father has to do is to cultivate an open and loving orientation toward his son, including the wish that his son be safe and well, but without fantasizing about seeing a letter in the mailbox and fastening onto that as his deliverance from despair. We can now go back to Marcel's idea that hope involves a certain creative process. This means we have to practice letting go of being fixated on a particular object or outcome so that our hope can transcend such attachment. In Buddhist terms, we need to hope without craving. In this way, we move from I hope that, relative hope, to I hope, unconditional hope. Take again the example of the terminally ill person. Naturally, the person hopes that they will recover. But given the diagnosis, the patient has to surmount this relative hope. They have to rise above imagining or fantasizing about the positive outcome of being cured, while at the same time not capitulating before the negative outcome of death. This doesn't mean not feeling disappointment. It means not being overcome by disappointment. This requires an inner creative process of transformation. The kind of hope that results, Marcel says, is an experience of security in one's being, where one's being isn't defined by desire. This is unconditional hope, the opposite of despair, the opposite of capitulating before one's fate. The example of the prisoner also illustrates these points. Marcel was writing during the Nazi occupation of France. He says the prisoner is a patriot and hopes for the liberation of his country. So the prisoner's hope does have a definite object, but he realizes he may never live to see this. To give up hoping, to despair, would be disloyal. It would be to loosen the bond between him and his country's future, whereas to hope would be to strengthen that bond and the bond between him and his fellow prisoners. They may be liberated even if he isn't. So the bond of love between them involves his feeling joy for their liberation. His hope means feeling joy for their joy. We can also now see that unconditional hope is fundamentally a matter of communion, of not being self-centered. A crucial feature of unconditional hope is not wanting something for my sake alone, but also for others, for the bond uniting me with them, for all of us who share in that hope. Now, this makes sense in the case of the prisoner, but what about hope in the case of the terminally ill patient? If I'm terminally ill, how can my hope involve my bond to others when it's solely my own life that's at stake? To put the question another way, how can I hope unconditionally when there's nothing else to hope for but that I will live? How can this be a case of I hope and not I hope that I will live? What's to hope for when I know that I'll die? And of course, we are all going to die. Marcel doesn't directly answer this question in this essay, but he does in another later essay he wrote called Desire and Hope. There he writes, "My death is important to me in relation to the other and the grief it is likely to cause him." So although I can't hope that I will live if I know I'm suffering from a terminal illness, I can form a bond of love with others. And this enables me to hope for them or for us, for the communion we have. This unconditional hope is inseparable from love, and from love in a specifically selfless or spiritual sense. Marcel puts this by saying that all hope is hope for salvation or liberation. Remember, he sees us as all caught in captivity, but not salvation or liberation for me, but for us. Unconditional hope is hope for us, which Marcel understands to mean hope for the whole human community. We come now to Marcel's formula for unconditional hope, which is, I hope in you for us. He actually says, I hope in thee for us. The prisoner refuses despair, refuses declaring that all is lost forever for his country, because he isn't alone, but is joined with his fellow patriots. The ill person refuses despair, refuses going to pieces at the prospect of death because of his bond with others, with family and friends. Taken further, each of us refuses despair because of the bond of love we form with each other, with the human community, a bond that's always mediated through particular others, through you. With this full picture of hope, we can now look at Marcel's last example, the mother who hopes for her son's return, even though she knows he's dead. This example is a way of posing the question whether it can make sense to hope, even when all reasons for hope are lacking. Marcel says we have to distinguish between the judgment we make as outside observers and what the mother herself does as a matter of her own subjectivity. We are allowed to say, his return is impossible, so her hope is unreasonable. But within her may be a loving thought that repudiates or tries to rise above the facts, and we have no right to dispute her right to do this, to carry on with love and hope against all hope. Marcel's point here is delicate, and you have to decide for yourself whether you think it works. If her love is based on nothing but desire, then her hope is illusory. But if her hope transcends desire, that is to say, if it's rooted in a non-desiderative spiritual love, if it's for the communion of herself and her son, which as a communion is also a vehicle for the communion of all of us, then it expresses a non-egotistical love and should not and cannot be denied. What the mother may be doing is hoping for us by way of hoping for a particular you, namely her son. And this may be a way of refusing despair and creatively transforming herself into a vehicle of love. It's interesting to juxtapose this example with the famous Indian Buddhist story about the woman Kisagotami. She is born into a poor family, has the good fortune to marry into a wealthy family, but she receives no respect and is badly treated until she gives birth to a son. Her happiness and good fortune, however, are short-lived because her son dies when he becomes old enough to run around and play. Mad with grief and having lost her family status, she refuses to part with her child's body and wanders everywhere, carrying the body on her hip, searching for medicine to bring him back to life. Everywhere she goes, she is mocked and driven away. Finally, a kind man takes pity on her and directs her to the Buddha. She begs the Buddha for medicine to revive her son, and he tells her to fetch a mustard seed from a house in which no one has died. She goes from house to house, searching frantically, but everywhere she goes, she cannot find a single house in which no one has died. Eventually, it dawns on her that death is inevitable and common to all, and that everyone experiences grief when loved ones die. She lays her son's body to rest in the charnel ground and goes back to the Buddha. He asks her whether she has gotten the mustard seed. She says the matter of the mustard seed is done and asks to be admitted to the monastic order. She is ordained and eventually attains liberation. What's notable here is that the Buddha doesn't negate her hope from the outside. He doesn't tell her it's misplaced or illusory. Instead, he creates the conditions for her to come to see things differently herself. Kisagotami's new perception includes an experience of communion, in the sense that she comes to understand love, grief, and death as common to us all. Of course, the interesting difference from Marcel's case of the loving mother is that Kisagotami stops hoping for her son's return. Instead, she overcomes despair by relinquishing his body and accepting his death. And then she experiences another new communion in the form of the Buddhist monastic community or Sangha. But the point I want to make here is that her path is a path of hope in Marcel's sense, because it's oriented toward rising above despair and toward liberation from captivity, the captivity of samsara. Let me summarize things and then end by relating these ideas to us here and now, specifically to our climate crisis. I've used Marcel to argue that unconditional hope is orientation to the good as such, not a particular desired or fantasized good outcome. The good as such is love, which is embodied in our communal life and recognition of each other. Applying this idea to the negative assessments of hope we looked at earlier, we get the following. Unconditional hope doesn't divert our attention from the present, but grounds us in the present while orienting us toward an open future that we can't presume to know. It's how we can hope in the dark, to use Rebecca Solnit's phrase. Unconditional hope isn't a kind of clinging because it works creatively to transform desire. Unconditional hope doesn't arise in tandem with fear, it's the antidote to despair. For these reasons, unconditional hope does far more than just lighten hardships. Unconditional hope is compatible with urgent action, but it motivates by fostering calm decisiveness rather than panic. Unconditional hope isn't a feeling or even a state of mind, it's a mode of being. It has to be enacted and practiced. In this way, it's active, in a way not unlike Joanna Macy's idea of active hope. She writes, active hope is a practice. Like Tai Chi or gardening, it is something we do rather than have. It is a process we can apply to any situation, and it involves 3 key steps. First, we take a clear view of reality. Second, we identify what we hope for in terms of the direction we'd like things to move in or the values we'd like to see expressed. And third, we take steps to move ourselves or our situation in that direction. The only qualification I would add to this is that the second step is the delicate one. Marcel teaches us that we need to identify what we hope for in terms of hoping in each other for us. Hope should be oriented by selfless love and care, apart from whatever particular directions we'd like to see things move in. This point is important because we may find ourselves unable to envision what we hope for. We may find ourselves in a situation where we must hope, but the object of our hope is unimaginable to us. Jonathan Lear calls this kind of hope radical hope. He sees it exemplified in the actions of Plenty Coups, the last great chief of the Crow Nation, who led his people to give up their hunter-warrior way of life, align with Europeans against other indigenous tribes, and voluntarily move onto reservations. Plenty Coups exemplified courage and hope, even though he couldn't envision what the new life would be for his people. Now, I have to say that Lear's treatment of this case, despite being moving and powerful, is very problematic. He doesn't engage with contemporary indigenous thinkers and their scholarship. They have no real presence in his writing. He comes perilously close to pronouncing on matters such as the conflict between Plenty Coups and the Sioux chief Sitting Bull. That's not his place to decide. And he arguably distorts the experience of the Crow people in certain ways in order to serve his own philosophical ends. Nevertheless, Lear's point that there is a kind of hope in which one holds out for goodness despite not having the concepts to understand what that goodness would be, that is a very important point. It means that active hope can't always be hope for particular outcomes. Sometimes it's just hope in the dark, not just hope in the dark, but radical hope for something unimaginable. What Marcel would add is that it still can and must be hope in you for us. Let me conclude with one more thought about Marcel's formula, I hope in you for us. Marcel understands us to mean the whole human community. The climate crisis presents probably the greatest historical challenge to realize this sense of community and the justice it entails. As we know, some people and nations stand to suffer far more from climate change than others, even though the crisis is a collective one. But I would also argue that we need to enlarge the us of I hope in you for us to include the more than human world, by which I mean not just non-human life forms, but also the whole planetary biosphere or ecosphere. I submit that enacting hope as we encounter the climate crisis requires an expanded ecological conception of community and a correlative enlarged unconditional hope, a hope in Earth for all of us. I would like to end with a remembrance of my friend Louis Charlon. Louis wrote poetry and dedicated one of his poems to me. The poem can be read as being about hope and renewal, among other things. The poem is based on some lines from Céline, which are in the notes on the right-hand side of the slide, and the poem is called Paris Against Their Words. Autumn here, winter coming, summer color, Pernod gone. On your quay, the bouquiniste, old guard, plan their yearly winter siege. Behind haggard stalls and gitane smoke, they brag of conquest and how they'll take you. Yet what words will they use this year? And what words are there left? Maybe Malraux, Céline, Sartre, or Proust, or perhaps Beckett, Zola, or Camus. But why ever want the Seine to freeze, your pulse to stop, to still you, seize you, word you, all for art? How futile. To think that even if the Seine did freeze, that spring would never come. To think that words can capture life, that stubborn crystals never melt. Thank you very much for listening. Whoops.